Kieran, I think both sides would be happy with the outcomes from that meeting. Apart from some boilerplate agreements on things like joint programs to support countries in our region who have been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, there was also some statements around enhancing our national defence cooperation. But really, one of the key takeaways was the alignment in rhetoric and policy stance on China. I think from the US side, they'd be happy to have had this public platform to really make some very strong statements about how they regard China and its behaviours. They're sending a message not just to Australia, but they name-checked some partners in Japan and India. And the messaging there is, there's been a growing narrative in recent years that America has disengaged from our part of the world under an America First policy. This message to Australia saying, we stand beside you, will have been heard in capitals from Japan through ASEAN to India. I think the Australian side would have been very happy for two reasons. They achieved two objectives. One was a very public display of the strength and the depth of the alliance. Very important at this time. Australia's been very forward-leaning in some of its strong statements on China, almost to the point of sticking its neck out. And what this enabled Australia to do was to make sure we were in strong alignment with the US policy. And I think the second thing that Australia will get out of this was it demonstrated that Australia is able to maintain a very strong alliance, a very deep alliance with the United States, and still maintain an independent foreign policy and an independent national defence policy. Australia declined the US request to join it in some of the more contentious freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. And in doing so, I think the Australian delegation quite neatly squared that circle. We're an independent country with an independent policy, but we remain committed to this alliance and to this partnership.
I was also interested in the language, the difference in the written statement, which was very strong communique, and then Foreign Minister Payne used a more diplomatic language, so to speak, in the news conference when it comes to China. You're
right, and it's noticeable, I think, in the Minister for Defence's statement as well, the same point. I think Australia walks a very fine line. We are closely aligned with the United States. We are great partners, but we have this close economic partnership with China as well. I think Dennis Richardson put it quite well when he said we're friends to both, but allies with one. And I think back on home soil, both ministers were keen to reinforce that we are independent. This isn't just about the US alliance. There's a broader picture here.
How do you think China is going to react to the statements and to the outcomes of those AUSMIN talks?
China won't be happy. The AUSMIN communique called out China on four very specific areas that are hot-button issues for China. It called out China's anti-democratic actions in Hong Kong. It reiterated support for Taiwan. It reframed and restated the shared view that China's actions in the South China Sea are illegal. And it also called out China's repression of the Uyghurs and other minority groups inside China. So China won't react well to that.
Mark, is there a risk that Australia will be seen as too closely aligned with the US when it comes to China?
There's been a narrative for a number of years that Australia walks too easily in the footsteps of the United States, that we may even be seen to be at their beck and call, going back to the tag under the John Howard era of the Deputy Sheriff. I think that's misguided. I think the reality is this alliance is built on a long shared history, including standing shoulder to shoulder in times of intense conflict. But it's also built on the back of a deep well of shared values, respect for the democratic process, respect for the rule of law, respect for human rights. It shouldn't be a surprise that when two countries come from that position of a long shared history and a deep set of shared values, that often they arrive at the same conclusion on matters of policy, and particularly when it comes to threats that they might be confronting. But as I say, I think the delegation, the Australian delegation at AUSMIN did a pretty good job of making clear that there is a limit, even within the closest of alliances. We will stand up for our own national interests, and at times we will say no to the United States.
On another topic, we saw last night on the ABC a story focusing on conspiracy theories and 5G networks, basically, disinformation when it comes to 5G. And the Communications Minister suggested that state actors might be behind some of that disinformation. How likely do you think that other countries are responsible for that sort of thing?
Well, I think the Minister was right to say you can't rule out the possibility that state or quasi-state actors are behind some of the disinformation and some of the conspiracy theories. I don't have access, obviously, to the evidence in front of the government about who's doing what, but the fact the Minister didn't name-check anyone in particular, I think, points to one of the problems that all governments had in situations like this of cyber intrusion or cyber attack. And the first problem is attribution. Is it country X or is it country Y? Is it agency A or agency B? And Australia is very fortunate to have a world-class leading-edge cyber security agency through the Australian Signals Directorate. Hugely competent people, very good at identifying the signatures that hackers leave behind. But of course the hackers themselves are also very sophisticated. They deliberately leave behind false clues, red herrings, sometimes deliberate false flagging to suggest another country might be responsible. So even with all the skill and the expertise of the Australian Signals Directorate, governments are normally presented with a statement of probabilities rather than a statement of certainty. And of course that makes attribution and any response very difficult.
We're now 3 months out from the election. We're hearing President Trump talk a lot about the mail-in votes, the credibility of these postal votes. Are you concerned about the message you're hearing from President Trump? Because if it is a close election and he doesn't win, this is raising a lot of questions as to what happens next.
Unfortunately, it has been a hallmark of this presidency that the president tends to tweet or say things perhaps without having given full consideration to the impact and the import of the words that he uses. Recently, he's talked about possibly deferring the election in November. He, in his words, talked about it being quibbated or rigged. I note that there's very little support from the Republican side of politics for that. Even his close congressional allies walked away from that very quickly. But the real problem here is if the president maintains this kind of language right through, up to, during, and possibly after an election if he were to lose, this delegitimizing of a presidential election, really has the possibility to take the US down a very, very dangerous path in a country that's already deeply divided.